Who invited you here? Did you sneak away from your typing desk just to watch real men handle real business? Those were the cruel words my wealthy father sneered at me outside the Pentagon security gate. He and my brother completely looked down on me, believing I was just a low-level civilian clerk. But the very second I placed my biometric ID card onto the digital scanner, the security terminal triggered a silent alarm, and the armed agents instantly froze in sheer terror when they realized who I really was. For 32 years, I allowed my toxic family to treat me as an invisible afterthought while I quietly operated in the deepest shadows of national intelligence. They came to the Pentagon that morning chasing a multi-million-dollar contract, utterly oblivious to the fact that the entire military apparatus was waiting upstairs to bow to my command. This story is a powerful testament to human dignity, equality, and the unstoppable triumph of an underestimated soul. If you believe every human being deserves absolute respect, please hit like, subscribe to our channel, and let us dive into the truth together.
The cool Washington, D.C. Spring breeze swept across the concrete plaza of the Pentagon, carrying with it the distant hum of morning traffic and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of polished dress shoes. Doctor! Clara Vance stood quietly in the security line, her face a mask of serene composure that had taken her more than 3 decades to perfect. She wore an elegant, tailored navy blue designer pantsuit, its sharp lines projecting a quiet, modern authority. Yet it bore no medals, no patches, and no overt hints of her true standing. For 32 years, Clara had operated in the deep, silent corridors of national security, intentionally allowing the world, and most painfully, her own family to underestimate her. It was simply easier that way. It was easier than engaging in exhausting, defensive arguments at family dinners, and easier than trying to force open eyes that had chosen to remain willfully blind to her worth. To the public, and to the men standing just a few feet ahead of her, she was merely a civilian data clerk, an administrative ghost pushing paper in a windowless basement, somewhere within the massive military apparatus. Directly in front of her stood Arthur Vance, her 79-year-old father, a towering, wealthy real estate mogul from Texas, whose entire worldview was built on a rigid foundation of financial dominance, masculine bravado, and high-profile prestige. Beside him was Julian, Clara's 59-year-old older brother and the family's anointed golden child. Julian was the CEO of a luxury commercial real estate firm, a business that was currently hemorrhaging money and standing on the precipice of bankruptcy, though neither he nor Arthur would ever admit it publicly. They were attending the Pentagon that morning because Julian was desperately bidding on a minor civilian contract for military housing, a deal he hoped would save his failing empire. Arthur had spent the entire morning laughing loudly, clapping Julian on the back, and treating the upcoming civilian briefing as if it were a coronation for his son. When Arthur turned around and realized Clara was standing in the very same security line, the boisterous smile on his sun-weathered face instantly withered into a familiar, condescending sneer. "Who invited you here?" Arthur asked, his voice boisterous and deliberately sharp enough to cut through the quiet murmurs of the surrounding crowd. Several nearby dignitaries and corporate executives paused their conversations, shifting their glances toward the family. Arthur stepped forward, looming over Clara with a patronizing grin that she had seen 1,000 times since her childhood. "This isn't a museum tour, Clara. Did you sneak away from your typing desk just to watch real businessmen handle real affairs? Or let me guess, you're somebody's +1. Julian let out a loud, mocking chuckle beside him, adjusting his expensive silk tie with an air of unearned superiority. "Be careful not to get lost, Clara," Julian added, his tone dripping with false concern. "We are trying to secure a multi-million-dollar defense partnership today, and the last thing we need is for you to embarrass the family name in front of the high-ranking military officials we are here to impress." Clara met her father's icy blue eyes, her expression completely unbothered. Though an old, familiar ache flared deep within her chest. Her mind briefly flashed back to her childhood in Ohio, remembering how Arthur had proudly displayed Julian's mediocre high school football trophies on the living room mantel, while tossing Clara's straight, her report cards into a kitchen drawer without a second glance. She remembered the day she received her master's degree in cybersecurity, a milestone her father completely ignored to spend 2 hours discussing a used truck Julian wanted to buy for a failed landscaping business. Arthur had always believed that a woman's true place was in a supporting, quiet role, firmly beneath the shadow of a man's visible success. Clara did not utter a single word in self-defense. She didn't announce her accomplishments, nor did she explain that she had crossed oceans, commanded tactical war rooms, and advised presidents while they were busy playing golf with local politicians. Instead, she offered them a polite, cryptic smile and stepped calmly toward the heavy, armored security checkpoint. As Clara stepped up to the high-security biometric scanner, the atmosphere around the Pentagon entrance remained casual, filled with the low chatter of incoming guests and the shuffling of briefcases. Arthur and Julian stood just a few feet away, watching her with smirks on their faces, fully expecting her to be turned away or directed to a public visitor's desk. Clara calmly opened her purse, pulled out a sleek, black, high-clearance biometric ID card, a Tier 1 command credential issued only to the nation's highest leadership, and placed it firmly onto the digital reader. For a fraction of a second, there was a heavy silence. Then, instead of the standard green flash, the scanner emitted a low, resonant chime that triggered an immediate, automated lockdown of the civilian lane. The security agent monitoring the screen froze instantly. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he had seen a ghost. He snapped his eyes from the monitor to Clara's face, his posture instantly straightening into rigid military perfection, without breaking eye contact. The agent pressed his hand firmly against his earpiece, his voice dropping to an urgent, commanding whisper. Package Alpha is active at Checkpoint Echo. Repeat, Package Alpha is on site. Clear Corridor 4 immediately and deploy the Tier 1 escort detail now. Within less than 5 seconds, the heavy double doors behind the security desk burst open. 3 armed, high-level federal security personnel appeared, moving with absolute precision and lethal purpose. The casual, polite atmosphere of the plaza vanished in an instant. The conversations among the waiting guests died out, replaced by a tense, breathless silence as people rapidly stepped aside to clear a path. The lead agent did not look at Arthur or Julian. He marched directly past them, his boots thudding heavily against the polished floor, and halted right in front of Clara. He brought his hand up to his brow in a crisp, reverent salute. Ma'am, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are already assembled upstairs. We have cleared the route. We will escort you through the secure private elevator immediately. Arthur's jaw dropped, his face twisting into a mask of utter, profound confusion. He stepped forward blindly, his old-school arrogance overriding his common sense as he tried to yell over the agent's shoulder. Wait, officer, you have the wrong person. There has been a massive glitch in your system. She is just a low-level civilian clerk. She doesn't belong here. The lead agent pivoted on his heel, his eyes turning into ice as he locked his gaze onto Arthur, physically shifting his weight to block the older man from getting any closer to Clara. Sir, step back immediately and keep your voice down, the agent warned, his tone dangerously calm. You are currently interfering with a Tier 1 national security commander. Any further disruption will result in your immediate federal detention under civilian lockdown protocols. Julian froze beside his father, his face turning an ash-gray color as he looked from the armed guards to the high-tech terminal, completely unable to process what he was witnessing. Clara stood at the center of the security circle, the very picture of poise and unshakable grace. She quietly picked up her identification card, slipped it back into her designer purse, and adjusted the lapel of her navy suit. For the first time in 56 years, she looked at her father and did not see an intimidating, powerful patriarch. She saw an old man who was genuinely terrified because the fragile reality he had constructed for himself was beginning to shatter. Captain Thomas Burke, a distinguished Navy officer who had served as Clara's trusted ally for 2 decades, stepped out from the secure corridor to join her. He offered her a warm, knowing smile and gently placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, his voice low and grounding. Today, Clara, the ghost of your father's approval finally dies. You've spent 30 years in the shadows protecting this country. It's time to step into the light. They are waiting for you upstairs. Clara nodded to Thomas, took a deep, liberating breath, and walked gracefully past her frozen family, leaving them standing in the dust of their own outdated assumptions. The heavy, Soundproofed doors of the main Pentagon auditorium swung open, revealing a grand, cavernous hall bathed in soft, amber lighting that cast a solemn glow over rows of velvet-cushioned seats. Dr. Clara Vance walked down the center aisle, her movements fluid and dignified, flanked by the high-level security detail and Captain Thomas Burke. As she approached the front of the auditorium, the sharp clicking of her shoes was swallowed by the ambient hum of hushed conversations among international ambassadors, cabinet members, and four-star generals. Clara was guided to a prominently placed leather chair in the front row, a restricted VIP section reserved exclusively for the nation's highest-ranking leadership and military commanders. Thomas sat directly beside her, his presence a steady anchor in a sea of overwhelming formality. He leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd before whispering to her with a mixture of pride and quiet intensity. He reminded her that for 3 decades, she had allowed her family to define her worth through their own narrow, superficial lens. But today, the grand illusion they had built to keep her small was going to collapse under the weight of an undeniable truth. Clara offered a subtle nod, her gaze resting on the grand stage where the flags of the United States and the Joint Chiefs of Staff stood tall and motionless. Meanwhile, at the back of the massive hall, a completely different kind of tension was unfolding. An usher had guided Arthur and Julian Vance to the very last rows of the general civilian seating area, far removed from the center of power. Arthur's face was still flushed with an angry, bewildered crimson, his chest heaving under his expensive but suddenly suffocating suit jacket. He sat down heavily, his hands gripping the wooden armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white, while Julian frantically tapped on his smartphone, his thumbs flying across the screen in a desperate attempt to find any logical explanation for what had just transpired at the security gate. Julian whispered harshly to his father, his voice trembling with a mixture of bruised ego and mounting panic, insisting that there had to be a catastrophic administrative error or a case of mistaken identity. He speculated that Clara must have stumbled into a massive federal investigation. Or perhaps she was being brought in by armed agents to be interrogated for a security breach at her typing job. They simply could not accept and logically refused to process the reality staring them in the face. Because admitting Clara's importance meant admitting that their own lives, their wealth, and their patriarchal arrogance were entirely secondary. They clung to their deceit like a shield, desperately waiting for the guards to realize their mistake and drag Clara out of the front row in shackles. The room suddenly fell into a breathless silence as the civilian aide stepped to the podium and announced the arrival of the Secretary of Defense. The military band in the corner initiated a soft, reverent fanfare, and every single uniform-clad individual in the room snapped to attention. From her vantage point, Clara could feel the burning stare of her father boring into the back of her neck, but she kept her eyes fixed forward. The Secretary of Defense adjusted his glasses, looked out over the sea of distinguished guests, and began to speak about a highly classified, decade-long counter-cyber warfare operation that had quietly saved the nation's financial infrastructure and defense networks from a devastating foreign state collapse. He spoke of an operation executed in absolute secrecy, led not by a loud, boastful politician or a wealthy corporate tycoon, but by a brilliant, relentless strategist known in the highest intelligence circles only as the architect. The secretary's voice echoed powerfully through the auditorium, detailing how this anonymous commander had sacrificed holidays, personal comfort, and public acclaim to fight an invisible war in the digital trenches, often minimized and overlooked by society, and even her own peers simply because she did not fit the traditional, aggressive mold of wartime leadership. Julian leaned over to Arthur, his brow furrowed as he muttered that this top-secret military presentation was a waste of their time and had absolutely nothing to do with their real estate bid. Arthur, however, did not reply. For the first time all morning, a cold, sickening dread began to take root in the pit of his stomach. On the massive projection screen behind the stage, a multimedia presentation suddenly illuminated the darkness, displaying a series of declassified archival photographs, heavily redacted federal documents, and high-level command logs. The audience gasped softly as the images shifted from lines of complex global code to actual photographs of the operations command center. There, standing at the head of a massive war room surrounded by heavily decorated generals and intelligence directors, was Clara Vance. The screen showed her receiving a private commendation inside the Oval Office from a previous president, standing on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier during a global crisis, and leading international security summits in Europe. Every single piece of useful evidence displayed on that screen was a devastating strike against the 30-year lie Arthur and Julian had lived by. The reality was laid bare before the world, and the true identity of the woman they had mocked as a useless clerk was about to be shouted from the rooftops. The Secretary of Defense paused, letting the weight of the visual evidence settle over the stunned audience before he took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone with absolute, resonant clarity. He stated that the time for anonymity had officially come to an end, and that the nation could no longer allow its greatest defenders to remain invisible in the shadows of history. He looked directly toward the front row, his face breaking into a respectful smile as he delivered the final, crushing blow to the illusions of the Vance family. It is my distinct privilege, under the confirmation of the United States Senate and the authority of the Department of Defense, to officially introduce the newly appointed Rear Admiral and Director of Global Cyber Security, Dr. Clara Vance. The moment her name left his lips, the entire auditorium erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. Hundreds of four-star generals, foreign dignitaries, elite naval officers, and Secret Service agents slammed their hands together, the sound echoing like cannon fire against the high ceilings of the hall. Clara rose from her seat with slow, mesmerizing poise, her posture straight, her head held high as she walked toward the steps of the stage. At the back of the room, the world completely shattered for Arthur Vance. The program booklet he had been holding slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering uselessly to the floor as his mind replayed every single insult, every cruel laugh, and every dismissive comment he had ever hurled at his daughter over the last 3 decades. He watched, completely paralyzed, as the daughter he had dismissed as an administrative nobody walked up to the stage, where the highest leaders of the free world stood waiting to shake her hand and to salute her command. Beside him, Julian looked physically ill, his face a pale, sweating mask of absolute humiliation. He realized that his entire identity as the successful, millionaire son was an utterly meaningless joke compared to the global power and historic legacy his sister had built entirely on her own. Arthur stared at the stage without blinking, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized that Clara's immense success hadn't happened overnight. It hadn't been handed to her, and it wasn't a fluke, it was the result of decades of grueling, brilliant, and dangerous labor that he had willfully refused to see because he was too busy celebrating Julian's superficial, monetary existence. The realization that he had spent his entire life being blind to greatness in his own home was a psychological weight that instantly aged him by 10 years. Clara reached the center of the stage, accepted the official command citation, and turned to face the crowd as the applause gradually subsided into an expectant, reverent silence. The Secretary of Defense smiled and asked if the newly confirmed Rear Admiral would care to say a few words to the assembly. Clara had not prepared a formal speech, but as she stepped up to the microphone, her eyes swept across the vast audience, briefly locking onto the 2 frozen figures sitting in the very back row. When she spoke, her voice did not carry a single hint of petty malice, mockery, or arrogance. Instead, it possessed a profound, healing authority that commanded absolute respect. She spoke directly about the fundamental nature of human dignity, gender equality, and the quiet, invisible sacrifices that truly keep a society safe from collapse. She told the audience that true power does not need to shout. It does not need to demand a large house, a loud voice, or the systematic subjugation of others just to make itself feel important. She addressed the decades she spent being told that her work was merely clerical or secondary because of her gender, using her own life as a living testament to the fact that a person's value is never determined by the narrow, prejudiced boxes that others try to build for them. Clara's words cut through the air like a scalpel, delivering a masterful lesson in human rights and mutual respect that left many in the audience nodding their heads in deep agreement. She emphasized that equality and honor are not privileges to be granted or withheld by a father, a brother, a boss, or a society. They are inherent human rights that belong to every individual from the moment they draw breath. She looked out at the sea of younger officers in the crowd and offered a powerful message of encouragement, telling anyone who was currently operating in the shadows, underestimated and overlooked to keep showing up and doing the job the right way. Because eventually, reality would leave their doubters with absolutely no choice but to face the truth. As she concluded her speech, thanking the mentors who had trusted her and the sailors who had inspired her, a second standing ovation swept through the hall, warmer and far more personal than the first. Clara stepped back from the microphone, her heart filled with a strange, liberating peace. She had not sought revenge, nor had she orchestrated a public humiliation. Instead, she had simply allowed the unyielding truth of her life to step into the light, leaving her family to drown in the sudden, suffocating depth of their own profound regret. The echoing waves of applause slowly died down as the formal ceremony drew to an official close just before noon. Across the expansive auditorium, high-ranking military officers began unfolding their printed programs, exchanging crisp handshakes, and filtering out toward the reception area in a sea of pristine uniforms and sharp civilian suits. Doctor! Clara Vance remained standing near the front stage for a few quiet moments, intentionally allowing the initial rush of moving crowds to clear past her. The morning had been an emotionally grueling marathon, testing her psychological resolve in ways that decades of navigating highly classified international cyber crises never could. Out in the dangerous digital trenches of her career, the enemy was always a calculated, predictable variable inside the fragile ecosystem of her own family. However, the wounds were deep, unpredictable, and fiercely personal. As she stood there, several senior officials, including two young cyber intelligence officers she had personally mentored years earlier, stepped forward to offer their quiet, deeply respectful congratulations. She thanked each of them with the same humble, poised grace that defined her leadership, but her peripheral vision remained locked on the far back corner of the emptying room. There, standing like statues under the grand military banners, her family was waiting. As Clara walked slowly toward them, the staggering shift in their family dynamic became visually undeniable. Her mother stood slightly in front, her eyes red from tears of profound, long overdue emotional release, while Julian stood completely deflated beside her, his arms crossed tightly as if trying to shield his bruised ego from the reality of the room. But it was Arthur Vance who looked the most drastically altered, the fierce, unyielding real estate tycoon who had spent his entire life dominating boardrooms and shouting down opponents looked suddenly devastatingly old. The heavy, arrogant posture that had dictated Clara's childhood was gone, replaced by a profound slumping of his shoulders, as though the weight of 32 years of ignorant pride had suddenly materialized on his back. Her mother immediately stepped forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Clara's neck and whispering a fierce, trembling confession of pride into her ear. Clara squeezed her back, feeling a quiet, long-buried piece of her childhood heart finally begin to mend. When they stepped apart, Julian met her gaze, the smug, patronizing smirk he had worn at the security gate completely wiped from his face. He shook his head slowly, a hollow, breathless laugh escaping his lips as he admitted that he had been completely, utterly oblivious to the magnitude of her life. He offered no excuses, no corporate spin, just the raw, defensive shock of a golden child who had finally realized he was standing in the shadow of a true giant. Then, Julian stepped aside, leaving Clara face to face with Arthur. The silence between father and daughter stretched out like a vast, canyon-sized void, heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 missed phone calls, ignored promotions, and dismissive dinner table comments. Arthur swallowed heavily, his eyes wandering weakly around the historic auditorium, taking in the grand stage, the flags, and the lingering four-star generals who still glanced at Clara with absolute deference. When he finally looked back at her, his voice was barely a whisper, fragile and stripped of all its lifetime Texas bravado. He confessed that he simply did not know. Clara looked at the trembling hands of her 78-year-old father, and a wave of complicated emotions rushed through her. Part of her wanted to unleash the torrent of questions she had carried for decades, to demand why he had never bothered to ask a single real question. Why he had celebrated Julian's superficial commercial failures while ignoring her historic military triumphs, and why his eyes had been so blind to her light. But as she looked at the raw, agonizing regret carved into his weathered face, she realized those old weapons no longer held power over her. The profound truth of her success was already absolute. It didn't need to be weaponized to be felt. She simply nodded and whispered back that she knew he didn't know. With those few words, the last remnants of Arthur's rigid defense mechanism completely disintegrated. In a quiet, trembling voice that stunned both Julian and her mother, the proud patriarch offered a genuine, deeply sorrowful apology. He openly admitted that he had been completely blinded by an outdated, shallow definition of success that only recognized things that were loud, wealthy, and easily visible. He confessed that because her vital work required secrecy and because she never bragged or demanded the spotlight, he had lazily assumed she was doing nothing important at all. He looked down at the floor, his voice wavering with a devastating realization as he asked her how many other ceremonies, how many other historic promotions and national awards he had willfully missed over the last 3 decades. Clara felt a sharp pang of sorrow as memories of lonely command changes and empty family seats flashed through her mind. She spoke the truth softly, admitting there had been quite a few. Arthur closed his eyes as the painful cost of his ignorance settled into his soul. He looked up at her, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, and whispered that he knew he could never rewrite the past, but he desperately wished he could. Clara offered him a gentle, truly liberating smile, taking his hand as she told him that while the past was unchangeable, the future was entirely theirs to build. 3 weeks after the life-altering ceremony at the Pentagon, the warm summer air settled over a quiet, sun-dappled diner nestled in the rolling hills halfway between Washington and Arthur's home. Clara sat at a small corner booth, watching through the window as her father arrived early, his steps noticeably slower but carrying a new, deliberate humility. He walked into the diner, nervously adjusting his worn baseball cap, and slid into the booth across from her with a look of quiet anxiety. For 30 years, their interactions had been defined by rigid, polite pleasantries that acted as a safety barrier against true connection. But as the waitress poured their coffee, Arthur leaned across the table, looked directly into his daughter's eyes, and spoke 5 words that Clara had waited an entire lifetime to hear. "Tell me about your career." For the next 2 hours, the old walls of division vanished entirely. Clara did not share classified state secrets, but she poured out the living heart of her journey, the brilliant young sailors she had led through digital storms, the crushing weight of midnight decisions during global crises, and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty she had forged with colleagues like Thomas Burke. Arthur listened without interrupting once, his eyes wide with a profound, newfound reverence as he asked careful, deeply invested follow-up questions, eager to finally learn who his daughter truly was. As the summer fully matured, the ultimate transformation of the Vance family manifested during a peaceful weekend cookout at her parents' suburban home. The backyard was alive with the joyful shouts of Arthur's grandchildren running through the green grass, while the rich aroma of grilling burgers drifted through the warm afternoon breeze. There were no military dress uniforms, no cold Pentagon security scanners, and no heavy federal badges. There was only the chaotic, beautifully imperfect reality of a family in the process of deep emotional healing. Clara stepped inside the quiet kitchen to refill a large glass pitcher of iced tea, her heart exceptionally light as she listened to the ambient sounds of family laughter outside. As she walked back through the hallway, a soft, familiar voice from the living room caused her to pause in her tracks. She glanced through the doorway and saw Arthur sitting on the sofa, his 2 youngest grandchildren gathered eagerly around his knees. He was holding a beautifully framed photograph that had recently been placed in the center of the family mantelpiece, an official portrait of Clara standing proudly beside the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. Clara stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway, holding the heavy pitcher of tea as she listened to her father speak to the children with a thick, undeniable note of reverent pride vibrating in his chest. He pointed to the shiny stars on Clara's uniform in the photo, telling the wide-eyed children that their grandmother had spent more than 30 grueling years quietly protecting the vital safety of the entire nation. When the youngest boy looked up and asked with innocent curiosity if Grandma Clara was a highly important person in the world, Arthur let out a soft, emotionally heavy laugh. He looked down at the photograph, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the frame, and delivered an answer that meant far more to Clara than any prestigious medal or military title ever could. Yes, she is incredibly important, but not because of her high rank or her shiny medals. She is important because she showed up every single day and did a monumental job the right way, even when nobody was watching. Clara stood alone in the quiet hallway, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. realized that the heavy, invisible armor she had worn for 30 years to protect her heart from her family's neglect was no longer needed. Later that evening, as the brilliant golden sun dipped below the horizon and fireflies began to dance across the twilight lawn, Clara and Arthur sat side by side on the back porch rocking chairs. The peaceful hum of the summer night enveloped them as Arthur looked out across the grass, a soft philosophical smile gracing his old face. He quietly admitted that for his entire life, he had foolishly believed that success was something loud, something that could be easily measured in bank accounts, flashy real estate logos, and public applause. He turned his head toward her, his eyes shining with absolute clarity, and thanked her for having the immense courage to give an ignorant old man a second chance to see the truth. Clara reached over and squeezed his hand, her heart entirely at peace. She realized that true forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the painful memories or rewriting the lonely chapters of the past. It means possessing the grand, beautiful strength to allow the future to be completely different. Her ultimate victory at the Pentagon wasn't about public humiliation or a petty, vindictive revenge. It was about stepping so radically into her own authentic power that she gave her family the ultimate human gift, the chance to break their own toxic cycles, to value human dignity above superficial noise, and to finally, truly see one another. The transformation within the Vance family did not remain confined to the quiet back porch in Ohio. It began to ripple outward, fundamentally altering how they interacted with the world around them. For Julian Vance, the shocking revelation at the Pentagon acted as a harsh but necessary mirror for his own life. For decades, he had coasted on the toxic assumption that his visible wealth and his father's constant praise made him superior, not just to his sister, but to the hundreds of employees who worked within his commercial real estate firm. However, as the summer progressed, Julian found himself sitting in his executive office, looking at his company's failing financial balance sheets with a completely new perspective. He realized that the aggressive, top-down management style he had inherited from Arthur, one that demanded absolute obedience and viewed workers as mere cogs in a machine, was the exact reason his business was collapsing from within. He had spent years underestimating the quiet, brilliant individuals on his own team, ignoring their insights just as his father had ignored Clara S. Driven by a newfound humility, Julian did something he had never done in his corporate career. He called a company-wide meeting, sat down at the table as an equal rather than a tyrant, and genuinely listened to the strategies of his junior data analysts. He began to implement principles of mutual respect, gender equality, and collaborative leadership that he had heard Clara speak about on the Pentagon stage. Slowly, the toxic culture within his firm began to heal, proving that when a leader stops demanding a loud voice and begins honoring human dignity, true success naturally follows. Meanwhile, Arthur Vance was fighting his own quiet battle against the deeply ingrained prejudices of his generation. The wealthy mogul, who had spent 50 years commanding rooms with a loud, unyielding Texas bravado, began to intentionally step back from the spotlight. He started spending his mornings reading through old journals and historical accounts of women in the military, educating himself on the structural barriers and quiet biases that his daughter had spent a lifetime conquering. One afternoon, Arthur attended a local charity gala hosted by his fellow real estate tycoons and elite, old school boys club, where success was traditionally measured by the size of one's mansion and the aggressiveness of one's business takeovers. As the men stood around in their expensive suits, sipping whiskey and boisterously bragging about their latest corporate conquests, one of Arthur's oldest colleagues turned to him and casually made a dismissive, patronizing joke about a young female executive who had recently been appointed to a major civic leadership role. In the past, Arthur would have laughed along, validating the casual sexism that kept his world order intact. But today, the memory of Clara's elegant navy blue suit and the thunderous standing ovation of four-star generals flashed vividly behind his eyes. Arthur set his glass down firmly on the table, his weathered face hardening into an expression of quiet, absolute seriousness that instantly silenced the laughter around him. He looked his colleague directly in the eye, his voice carrying the deep, resonant authority of a patriarch who had finally seen the light, and told him that underestimating a person based on their gender or their quiet demeanor was the greatest act of foolishness a leader could commit. He shared with the stunned group of businessmen that true power does not shout. It does not demand the subjugation of others to feel big. And it certainly does not belong exclusively to men in corporate boardrooms. He proudly told the room about his daughter, Dr. Clara Vance, explaining her monumental achievement as a Rear Admiral and the Director of Global Cybersecurity, emphasizing that she had operated in the dangerous, invisible trenches of national defense for 32 years while they were busy playing golf and making assumptions. The profound silence that followed his words was a testament to the weight of his conviction. Through his actions, Arthur was no longer just an apologetic father. He was actively dismantling the very structures of prejudice he had spent a lifetime building, demonstrating that it is never too late for a human being to change, to learn, and to stand up for the inherent rights and equality of others. As the golden autumn leaves began to fall across Washington, D.C., Dr. Clara Vance stood once again by the large windows of her executive office inside the Pentagon complex, looking out over the serene Potomac River. The heavy glass pitcher of tea from the summer cookout had been replaced by a sleek tactical interface on her desk, flashing with real-time global security diagnostics. Yet, her heart remained deeply anchored in the profound emotional peace she had found with her family. Captain Thomas Burke stepped into her office, carrying 2 mugs of warm coffee, his eyes crinkling with a supportive smile as he noticed the serene, unbothered posture of his fellow commander. He handed her a mug and quietly remarked that the entire atmosphere of the command sector had shifted since her confirmation ceremony. Younger officers, particularly the women who had long felt invisible in the male-dominated military apparatus, were now walking through the corridors with a renewed sense of pride and purpose. Clara took a slow sip of her coffee, nodding in agreement, realizing that her victory wasn't just a personal reconciliation with Arthur, it was a systemic beacon of hope. By refusing to meet her family's historical cruelty with malice, and by allowing her unyielding reality to speak for itself. She had set a permanent standard for how human values should be recognized in every institution of the free world. Turning directly toward the lens of the world, the heavy narrative transitions into a deeply intimate, philosophical reflection on the true weight of Clara S.'s journey. My friends! This extraordinary story was never merely about a dramatic identity reveal at a security checkpoint or a shocking twist inside the halls of military power. It stands as a profound, universal mirror reflecting a vital truth about the modern human condition and the systemic illusions that dictate our daily interactions. For generations, our global society has been deeply conditioned to measure the value of a human soul through visible, aggressive noise by the thickness of a bank account, the volume of a boastful voice, or outdated patriarchal structures that rigidly dictate who inherently belongs in the room of leadership. Too often, women, quiet strategists, and the humble servants of humanity are treated as somebody's guest in the very civilization they built with their unyielding blood, sweat, and intellect. But true honor can never be bought with currency, and it can never be claimed through the systematic minimization of another human being. True honor is rooted fundamentally in human dignity, equal rights, and the unconditional respect we owe to every single person from the moment they draw their very first breath. When we look at someone through the narrow, suffocating lens of prejudice when we assume their silence equals weakness or their humility equals a lack of power, we do not diminish their intrinsic worth. We only expose the tragic, suffocating blindness of our own character. Kindness, mutual respect, and absolute gender equality are not abstract political theories to be debated on television. They are the bedrock of human love, societal progress, and genuine evolutionary healing. Let Clara S.'s profound triumph be a gentle, enduring reminder to look much closer at the quiet individuals in your own life, your daughters, your mothers, your co-workers, and the neighbors whose struggles you know absolutely nothing about. Stop assuming, stop judging, and start listening with an open, compassionate heart. Because the most brilliant, revolutionary souls are often the ones quietly standing right beside you in the shadows, waiting for you to simply find the courage to see them for who they truly are. If Clara's masterful journey of resilience, self-worth, and ultimate family grace touch the deepest corners of your heart today, please take a brief moment to leave a comment below sharing your own personal experience. Have you ever had to earn respect the hard way against overwhelming odds? Have you ever found the monumental strength to break free from generational expectations or heal a broken family bond? Your authentic words might be the exact lifeline a struggling soul needs to read in the comments today. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up and turn on the notifications bell so you never miss our upcoming premium dramatic stories. By actively joining our global community, you help us champion more narratives of unsung heroes, generational healing, and the ultimate, beautiful triumphs of the human spirit. And finally, carry this solemn warning with you as you step out into the world. Be profoundly, deeply careful how you treat those who choose to stay silent in the face of your arrogance. Do not mistake their absolute patience for weakness, and do not mistake their grace for a lack of power. For when the veil of reality is inevitably pulled back by the hands of time, the shattering weight of your own regret may be a burden too heavy for your soul to bear. Protect your family. Honor your daughters and treat every single human soul with the absolute dignity they inherently possess. Thank you for walking this meaningful path with me today, and I look forward to seeing you in our next story. The transition of late autumn into the sharp, crisp chill of early winter brought a quiet sanctuary to the Vance family estate. Inside the warmth of the brick-faced home, the grand fireplace crackled merrily, throwing long, amber shadows across the living room walls, where Clara's official naval portraits now held a permanent place of honor. Arthur Vance spent his afternoons sitting by the hearth, his once boisterous demeanor completely replaced by a soft, reflective tranquility. He had taken to keeping a leather-bound journal on his lap, a private ledger where he painstakingly detailed the many decades of his own shortcomings, transforming his late-stage regret into an active daily practice of self-reckoning. He no longer sought to control the conversations or dictate the direction of family gatherings. Instead, he stepped gracefully into the role of an observer, a patriarch who had finally learned that the truest form of leadership begins with a quiet, listening heart. When Julian would visit, bringing reports of his real estate firm's steady economic recovery under his newly implemented ethical management policies, Arthur would simply smile, nod, and remind his son that the true wealth of a leader is measured exclusively by the dignity and respect they afford to the people who trust them. For Clara, this period represented the ultimate culmination of her long, invisible journey through the trenches of national security and emotional exile. Standing at the peak of her military career as a rear admiral, she found that the greatest victory did not manifest within the high-tech tactical rooms of the Pentagon, but within the quiet spaces of her father's profound emotional surrender. One evening, as a gentle blanket of winter snow began to dust the rolling hills outside, Arthur called Clara into his private study, a room that had once been a fortress of exclusive patriarchal business dealings. He sat beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp, his aged hands trembling slightly as he opened an old cedar chest that had remained locked for decades. From it, he pulled a weathered collection of handwritten letters, sketches, and faded report cards from Clara's childhood that he had secretly kept. Despite his outward indifference during those painful years, with tears glistening in his eyes, Arthur confessed that fear had driven his historical cruelty. He had been terrified of his own hidden inadequacies. And because Clara's brilliant, independent spirit did not require his financial support, he had foolishly pushed her into the shadows to focus on Julian's easily controlled monetary dependence. Clara listened to his raw confession, the final puzzle pieces of her family's generational trauma falling into place with absolute, heartbreaking clarity. She did not meet his vulnerability with judgment or past grievances. Instead, she walked over, placed a supportive hand on his frail shoulder, and delivered a masterful lesson in human compassion. She told her father that human beings are fundamentally imperfect creatures, bound by the limitations of the eras they were raised in and the fears they carry in their hearts. She explained that true forgiveness is not an act of weakness, nor is it a validation of past abuse. It is a monumental declaration of personal freedom, an internal power that allows a wounded soul to lay down the heavy anchor of resentment so the future can finally breathe. As Arthur wept softly, releasing the suffocating guilt he had carried since the Pentagon ceremony, Clara wrapped her arms around him, demonstrating that the ultimate measurement of a woman's strength is not her capacity to conquer her enemies, but her infinite ability to heal those who once sought to keep her small. As the new year dawned with absolute, brilliant clarity, the grand corridors of the Pentagon hummed with the focused energy of a nation moving forward into a progressive era of strategic global defense. Doctor, Clara Vance stood at the head of a state-of-the-art cyber command center, her navy blue uniform immaculate. The prestigious stars of a rear admiral gleaming under the sharp facility lights as she directed a multinational operation with unshakable precision. Beside her stood Captain Thomas Burke, his eyes reflecting a deep, enduring respect as he watched his lifelong colleague navigate the complex digital networks with the absolute confidence of a leader who had completely conquered both her professional and personal battlefields. The atmosphere within the command sector had been permanently elevated by her presence. Her historic triumph had shattered the old glass ceilings of the military institution, creating an invincible blueprint of equality and human rights that inspired a new generation of brilliant young women to step out of the shadows and claim their rightful places at the table of global leadership. Clara looked out across the busy war room, her heart filled with a profound, liberating peace, knowing that her long, 32-year exile in the dark trenches of underestimation had officially ended. Turning her gaze directly toward the lens of the world for the final, monumental conclusion of this hour-long dramatic journey. The narrative seamlessly elevates into a universal, philosophical testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. My beloved friends, the magnificent tapestry of Clara's life stands as a timeless, revolutionary beacon for every single soul who has ever had to walk through the cold, suffocating darkness of being overlooked, minimized, or systematically unappreciated by the very people who should have loved them the most. It serves as a stark, unyielding reminder that you're divine. Intrinsic value as a human being can never be weighed by the shallow metrics of a materialistic society, nor can it ever be diminished by the narrow, prejudiced minds of those who refuse to see your light. True success, true power, and true honor do not belong to the loudest voice in the room or the most aggressive conqueror in the corporate boardroom. They belong inherently to the resilient, invisible architects of humanity who show up every single day, doing the right job the right way with absolute humility, grace, and an unshakable commitment to human dignity. Let this profound story settle deep within your consciousness as an eternal warning against the catastrophic dangers of arrogance and judgmental assumptions. We must actively commit ourselves to building a world where gender equality, mutual respect, and human rights are treated as absolute, non-negotiable foundations of our shared existence, a world where every daughter is honored, every quiet strategist is seen, and every human soul is validated for their inherent worth rather than their proximity to external noise. Look around you today with eyes wide open with compassion. Look at your mothers, your sisters, your co-workers, and the quiet dreamers in your communities, and find the monumental courage to lift them into the light before regret becomes a burden too heavy for your soul to carry. Give Clara's ultimate victory of self-worth, generational healing, and magnificent grace has ignited a spark of hope in your heart today. Please leave your beautiful thoughts in the comments below, sharing your own path of resilience so we may inspire one another to keep moving forward. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a powerful thumbs up, and join our global community of unsung heroes as we continue to champion the beautiful, triumphant narratives of human love and ultimate emotional restoration. Remember always, the truth will always find a way to step into the light, and the grandest invitations in this life are never given, they are earned in the quiet, invincible corridors of your own unyielding soul. Thank you for walking this sacred, healing path with me today. Protect your loved ones. Honor the truth, and I will see you in our next extraordinary story.
My friends, the historic victory of Dr. Clara Vance is a profound mirror reflecting a vital truth about our shared modern world. For generations, society has conditioned us to measure a person's worth strictly by visible noise, by the thickness of a bank account, the aggressive bravado of a corporate tycoon, or outdated prejudices that rigidly dictate who belongs in the room of leadership. Too often, the brilliant, quiet, and humble servants of humanity are treated as mere guests in the very civilization they built with their unyielding sacrifice. But true honor cannot be bought, and it can never be claimed through the systematic minimization of another human being. True value is rooted fundamentally in inherent human dignity, absolute gender equality, and the unconditional respect we owe to every single soul from the moment they draw breath. When we look at someone through the narrow lens of arrogance, assuming their silence equals weakness or their humility equals a lack of power, we do not diminish their intrinsic worth. We only expose our own profound blindness. Clara's ultimate triumph didn't manifest through a petty, vindictive revenge. It bloomed when she found the monumental strength to give her aging father a second chance to break his own toxic cycles. Forgiveness does not mean erasing the lonely chapters of our past, nor does it validate the cruelty we endured. What true forgiveness does is possess the magnificent power to allow the future to be completely different. Look closer at the quiet individuals in your own life today, your daughters, your mothers, your coworkers, and recognize their late regret becomes a psychological weight too heavy for your soul to bear. If Clara's journey of resilience and ultimate family healing touched your heart, please leave your beautiful thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel to help us champion more narratives of the human spirit. And finally, carry this solemn warning with you into the world. Be deeply, profoundly careful how you treat those who choose to stay silent in the face of your arrogance. Do not mistake their absolute patience for weakness. For when the veil of reality is inevitably pulled back by time, the shattering weight of your own regret may be a burden too heavy to face. Treat every single human soul with the dignity they inherently possess. Thank you for walking this sacred path with me today, and I will see you in our next extraordinary story. Please note that the deep psychological themes, human rights narratives, and emotional arcs presented in this content were thoroughly researched, meticulously built, and manually edited by our dedicated team to ensure a unique, deeply meaningful, and transformative lesson for our global audience.